You know, when we think of the field of anthropology, we imagine a scientific discipline that must be rooted in careful observation, in meticulous study, in factual evidence. Fossil records, scientific models, and human origins, they should all be based on solid evidence, empirical data, peer-reviewed research, and commitment to uncovering the facts. However, as we delve into the history of human evolution, we uncover startling inconsistencies, instances where fundamental errors and misrepresentations have not only been overlooked, but have also been presented as pivotal breakthroughs in science when they're not. How could a dolphin be mistaken as an ape man, or a hippopotamus tooth be passed off as one of our ancestors' teeth? How about a crocodile? I mean, these aren't isolated incidents or simple oversights. They're part of a broader pattern that calls into question the integrity of the field itself. A new book series on human evolution has just been released, which documents these three aquatic ape men. And the author, Dr. Carl Werner, is here to weigh in on the utter lunacy of some of these findings. Now, Dr. Werner traveled to 16 countries on 6 continents, investigating these issues, and documented these three aquatic ape-man blunders, showing how the field of paleoanthropology has allowed itself to be misled or perhaps even intentionally misredirected to prop up the narrative of human evolution. Dr. Werner, number one, thank you for joining me. But number two, these are incredible stories. Tell me about this dolphin to ape-man blunder.
Well, I did this, by the way, in this book here, Volume 3. There's a whole chapter on it. I just want to show you this briefly, just to give the image. This ape man was created with a monkey skull bone and a dolphin collarbone. You can see the collarbone here in red. He misinterpreted a dolphin rib as an ape man collarbone. And that was in 1979 in northern Libya. He had a big expedition that was funded by the National Science Foundation and National Geographic, and his ape man was published at the American Museum's magazine called Natural History. It was in Nature, et cetera, et cetera. And only when he crossed the line and offended another evolution scientist did his colleagues call him out on it. They didn't call him out on it until he offended Dr. Don Johanson, who found Lucy. He said, "My ape man is better than your Lucy." And once he did that, then the evolution scientist stepped up and said, "No, that's a dolphin's rib."
Okay, but a dolphin's rib, I mean, like if I'm thinking about my rib, it cups around, my rib cage is basically, it's C-shaped. But if I think of a collarbone, that's almost like an S-shaped bone right up here. There's quite a difference between those two. So I guess my question would be, how could a scientist interpret this C-shaped dolphin's rib as an S-shaped ape-man collarbone?
Well, that's a great question, because, you know, when it was found by his colleague, Dr. Boaz's colleague, he recorded it as a mammal rib bone, which was round, you know, C-shaped,
yeah,
like you said. And Dr. Boaz had been at it for years, and he really wanted to find an ape man. And he kept looking at this C-shaped bone. He said, "You know what? I think it's actually half of an S-shaped bone. I can't see the rest of the S. All I see is the C. And so the part that's missing would be the rest of the letter S. But really, it was a C-shaped collarbone because it really was a dolphin's rib. It was the Pacific white-sided dolphin. It was the 7th rib. And yeah, he made that blunder because he wanted to find it, an ape man.
Now, that's a pretty unbelievable mistake. Maybe wishful thinking led to it, but doesn't it get worse? You describe in your new books about how a hippopotamus's tooth was once passed off as one of our ape-like ancestors. Can you tell me more about this? Because a hippo tooth as a human tooth, there's got to be more to this story.
Well, there is. And, you know, this is part of the group that made, you know, the Orsi ape man out of a donkey skull, which is still on display today in the museum in Spain. A donkey skull, and they got called out on it after a number of years, and they said, "Hey, that's just a donkey skull." And they bore down and said, "No, we believe this is an ape-man dig site." They then found this hippopotamus tooth fragment. Now, it looks nothing like a mammal, a human tooth. It looks nothing like an ape tooth. It's the enamel is very thick. It's extraordinary that they could make this mistake. But they and a whole group of their scientists went with this story that they had found further evidence that this donkey skull was real when it really wasn't. And then they said they found now an ape-man tooth to go with it, and it really was a hippopotamus tooth. That is very shameful. And it's shameful that they don't take this down from the museum that's still on display. People go to this museum, they don't understand that this is all bogus,
Well, I think common sense should dictate some things. I have been to Africa. I've seen these hippos many, many times floating with just their heads above the water. I've seen hippo teeth before. I've gotten close to a lot of these things, and it seems to me that it should be common sense, if you've studied these issues, that you should be able to see through some of this. But I guess that there is so much pressure on academia to find these types of things, and so much prestige if you are the discoverer of an ape-like creature turning into a human, that I guess there's this temptation where you can just overlook a lot.
And you're like a train without brakes. You keep going down the track faster and faster and faster. You have your museum that goes with it, and you've had 300 newspaper articles written about you, and now you just want to shut it off and say I was wrong. It's hard. And so you then you do crazy things like picking up a hippo tooth and say, oh, this is an ape man. Oh, and better yet, they picked up just ordinary rocks and they said, oh, these are 1,400 ape-man stone tools, and they're just ordinary rocks. Wow. They're also on display at that same museum.
Well, in your video series, because you have 2 brand new books, you have a video series, you showed how a very famous anthropologist, Dr. Leakey, mistakenly identified a crocodile bone as an ape-man bone. Now, how is that possible? What bone was it? Did it look similar in any way? What's the story?
It's always a partial fossil, then they interpret it as the full ape man. So they had this little piece of a crocodile femur. But see, it didn't have the ends. And so they said, you know what? I think this is an ape man collarbone. It's amazing how many times they come up with bones and they like horse toe bones or crocodile bones and say, oh, it's ape man collarbone. It's really funny,
Yeah. That's incredible. An ape-man collarbone from a crocodile femur. Now, Volume 4, we had you recently out to the Wonder Center, and I was looking through your books. In Volume 4, you listed, I think it was 237 different species of supposed ape men that were then overturned by evolution scientists. Now, besides those 3 mistakes that we've talked about so far, what about these other 234 that have been overturned over a few decades?
Well, 3 of them turned out to be just plain old monkeys. There was a whole bunch of them that were recently buried humans, just a few hundred years old. Dr. Dart did that, Tobias did that, and Dr. Broom. A whole bunch of them were humans, that's Homo sapiens, buried during the Ice Age, found with Ice Age animals. But they were just pure Homo sapiens. Some of them were extinct apes, like the famous one was Dr. Pilbeam from Harvard University had found an orangutan-like creature and said it was the new ape man. And then there's a whole group of ape men that were from altered fossils, like Lucy was altered, Homo habilis was altered, Turkana was altered. In all, there's 9 categories of animals that divide these 237 overturned ape men, and you have so many overturned ape men, you have to divide them to keep organized. And we have a list of those in the appendix of Volume 4.
Can you share just a little bit about Turkana for our viewing audience right now?
The Turkana we stumbled into this alteration because the photograph of the skull in different publications was altered. They altered the photograph, and then when we actually saw the original fossil, the skull was separated here between the middle and frontal part of the skull bone so that they could move the face forward. And then they created separations here up by the zygomatic and another facial area up here. And they moved the face forward. And when we brought this to Richard Leakey's attention, who found it, he told me, it's wrong. The reconstruction is wrong. And the photos, he didn't say this, but the photos were altered. Nobody knows that story. That's a brand new story that came out in our volume 4.
You know, when you start to, it's kind of difficult if you have facial plates that are supposed to be connected together and you artificially put gaps in them just to make a creature look the way you want to make it look, more human-like. That, again, appears to be very dishonest. But then when you go to place these representations of these animals in museums, and then you go so far as to give them completely upright poses with human facial characteristics in their muscles and skin tones, and then whites of the eyes. I mean, what more do we need to see that this is something that has been artificially propped up? It has nothing to do with real observable science. Tell me, why in the world did you get interested to do this?
Well, basically, I was challenged about my beliefs in evolution. I did believe in evolution while I was in medical school, and a friend challenged me. He says, I bet you couldn't prove evolution if you tried to. And me having my science background, that means I had to try to disprove it to prove that it was right. And I couldn't, everywhere I turned, evolution got disproved. And I was like, wow, this thing is a house of cards. And as I started to remove one card, this area collapsed, this area collapsed, this area collapsed. But it all started with a college bet with a friend challenging me about my beliefs in evolution.
I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Werner, for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, and thank you for allowing me to be on your show. And everybody needs to come down there to see their museum. It's a great public museum in Dixon, Tennessee, right next to Nashville. I was there last month. It is spectacular. You need a whole day to go through the museum. It really is worth your time.
Carl, we love it, and we love you. I can't wait to have you back in the future.
Thank you.
This new resource is a powerful refutation to the theory that humans evolved into apes. You can get your copy of Carl's new book, Volumes 3 and 4 of the Grand Experiment book series by visiting creationsuperstore.com. Now, if you prefer visuals, Carl has an 8-episode Grand Experiment video series. All of these things were filmed on location in Africa, in Europe, in Australia, and South America. It's also available in our bookstore. And for students, there's a school curriculum which is also available, preparing them with the tools that they need to be ready for, well, really any college professor that pushes their atheistic agenda on these unsuspecting students. Now, we're going to be back to highlight your stories and your experiences when we return to the Genesis Science Report.